Hello and welcome to the home of the Ghost Owl. Continuing our look at the rulebook, we're now on to the magic section. So this is looking at the generic principles behind magic and kind of how magic works in the game. So without further ado, let's take a look at how magic works in Warhammer The Old World. And I think an interesting one here will be for those veterans of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, in that this is going to be different. And so I hope it will be of use to not only the newer players to the game, but to those veterans as well. So when we start looking at wizards, right, so levels 1 to 4, the higher the level, the more powerful the wizard and the more points they cost. Wizard unit profiles will detail which laws of magic they can use. Normally they can use at least one, sometimes more than one, but your unit profile will detail that. Now, spells for each wizard are randomly determined before the armies are deployed. Right, so that's important. And then you roll the number of d6 equal to the level, and then you re-roll the duplicate. So level 4 wizard rolls 4 dice, and if you duplicate your numbers, you re-roll those duplicates until you got 4 individual numbers. Now, each law contains 7 spells. 6 of those spells are numbered. So the numbers that you've rolled on the dice will mean those are the spells that the wizard gets. However, each law does have one signature spell, and any wizard and any number of wizards may replace one of the randomly generated spells with that signature spell. So you've kind of always got this spell in your toolbox that you can go to if you haven't quite got the spells that you want, which is nice, and I like that system. Spell types. So we've touched upon this before in a Warhammer community article, but they've got much more clarity here. So you've got an enchantment. This essentially is a unit buff. You can only cast them on friendly units, and they can only be cast in the strategy phase. You cannot use the same spell on the same unit. So you can't use 2 wizards with the same spell to double buff the unit. If it was a different spell, that would be okay. So you can use 2 different spells to buff the same unit, but you can't use the same spell on the same unit. You also can't improve characteristics above 10. Now, Hex debuff, that can only be cast on enemy units, can only be cast in the strategy phase. You cannot use the same spell on the same unit, and you can't improve characteristics above 10, or more likely with a hex spell, and there's no typo on this slide, you can't reduce characteristics below 0. Though, of course, if you do reduce characteristics below to 0 of strength, toughness, or wounds, the model is dead. Now, then you have conveyance spells. Now, these are movement transport spells. They can only be cast on friendly units. They can only be cast in the movement phase. And you cannot use the same spell on the same unit. Then you have magic missiles. Well, this is where you're getting into your damage. Now, this is ranged damage. It can only be cast on enemy units. It can only be cast in the shooting phase. The magic missiles do require line of sight, and they automatically hit the target. So as long as you successfully cast the spell, it automatically hits. Then you've got magical vortexes. Now, this is range damage, but in a different way. So you do not require a target. Essentially, you just use the round template. Again, can only be cast in the shooting phase. However, it does remain in play, and we'll touch on that in a bit. However, it does move, and if it moves off the board, of course, it goes out of play. And finally, you have assailment spells. These are essentially melee damage spells. They can only be cast on enemy units that are in base contact with the wizard, and they can only be cast in the combat phase. However, they do automatically hit the target. Now, this is actually quite an interesting one for me, because typically you don't want your wizards in combat, but maybe you've got a wizard who's got a bunch of assailment spells who then need to be in combat to get the value for them. It's going to be interesting. So then, in terms of casting spells, so You can only cast each spell once per turn. So let's take your level 4 wizard. He's got 4 spells. He can cast all 4 spells in the correct phase through the turn, but he cannot cast the same spell more than once in the same turn. He cannot cast any spells if he's running away. Now, that definitely makes sense. And in combat, you can only cast assailment spells or range, and there'll be a range denoted on the spell that will say range self. All right, so they're the only ones. He can't cast magic missiles or buffs or anything like that unless it's got range self on it. Now, range self casts the spell on the wizard, though some of those spells will give an aura effect, so you still have some options there. So when you want to cast a spell, you roll 2 dice and you add the wizard level to it. And that gives you a casting score. Now, if that score is equal to or greater than the casting value, the spell is successfully cast. If you roll a double 6, the spell has what's called perfect invocation. This means the spell cannot be dispelled. If you roll a natural double 1, however, the spell is miscast, and then you roll on the miscast table, which is in the rulebook, and using 2 dice. Now, there are various effects, and I'm not going to detail it all here. However, anything 7 or less will cause damage to the wizard, and the lower that you roll, the more likely you're going to be damaging the wizard and potentially friendlies around him. Now, some units have a rule that has magic resistance, and magic resistance in brackets, and then it's a negative sign and then X. Now, that rule essentially means the characters and units modify the casting roll by the amount stated. So if it's if that says -2, then the enemy caster's casting score is reduced by 2. The rule is not cumulative, so only the highest value in the unit is used. So let's say the unit has a magic resistance of 2, but it's got a character in there that has a magic resistance of 3, and a spell is cast on that unit, you only use the 3. You don't suddenly make it 5. Then you also have these things called bound spells. Now, bound spells are normally spells which are contained within a magic item, I don't know, magic ring or something like that. Now, bound spells use a power level given as opposed to the wizard's level, so there'll be a power level in its rules. Now, a bound spell cannot get perfect invocation, but it also can't miscast, so that's quite nice. However, they can be dispelled as normal, and you can only cast 1 bound spell per phase. So if you're thinking of stacking 3 different magic rings on a character, it might give you flexibility, but you're not going to be casting more than 1 of those bound spells in the same turn. Or in the same phase, I should say, in the same phase. Okay, and coming up to the Dispel. So there are 2 types of Dispel. You have a Wizardly Dispel. So a level 1 and 2 wizard can dispel any spell that's cast within 18 inches of them. A level 3 and 4 wizard can dispel anything that's within 24 inches of them. That's not a huge distance, and again, does encourage you to keep your wizards up with the rest of your army. You're not sitting back at the table edge doing magic from afar. Now, you also can't dispel if your wizard is in combat or if he's running away. Now, if you don't have any wizards, you can have a Fated Dispel. Now, Fated Dispel is once per turn, where you may attempt a Fated Dispel. Now, normally, a Dispel roll is 2 dice plus the wizard level. That gives you a score. A Fated Dispel, you basically don't get that wizard level. You basically just get the 2 dice to get your score. Now, to dispel a magic cast, you must exceed the casting roll total to dispel. So if an enemy wizard had a casting score and he rolled, 6 on the dice, and he was a level 3, he's got a casting score of 9, you would have to roll 10 or more to dispel it, right? Because it's not equal to it. You have to exceed the roll to get the dispel. However, if you roll a double 6, you have what's called unbinding. Unbinding immediately dispels the spell. However, you cannot dispel, even with unbinding, perfect invocation. So if the person's lucky enough to roll a double 6 on their cast, it's going to happen. There's no way to stop it, not even with your own double 6. However, you do have the downside on dispelling that if you roll a double 1, you get outclassed in the act, and the dispelling wizard now must roll on the miscast table. So that's going to be quite interesting. Also, some spells may last longer than a phase or a turn, and that will be detailed in the spell, i.e. the spell lasts until then your next strategy phase, let's say. And so it will be detailed how long each spell lasts. Obviously, magic missiles tend to be instant, and then they're over. Now, we talked about magical vortexes and remains in play. So in terms of remains in play, a remains in play spell stays indefinitely until the caster is slain, the caster chooses to end the spell, or for whatever reason a randomly moving spell moves off the battlefield. Now, a remains in play spell can be dispelled, and the dispel roll only needs to exceed the casting value of the spell. So you don't need to remember what the wizard's total casting roll was. You only need to look at the magic card or the spell rules, and if it'll say this spell has a casting value of 10, then you only need to exceed that casting value. What the wizard rolled to put it in play is completely irrelevant at this point. And the last thing to note with wizards is wizards and armor. Wizards cannot wear armor or carry a shield. If they do, they cannot cast or dispel. And this includes magic armor unless a rule specifies otherwise. And there are some armors that have a specific note that say wizards can wear this armor and cast as normal. So just be clear about that. But normally, no armor of any type, no shield. However, wizards' mounts can wear barding with no effect, and that's because the armor is essentially on the horse, not on the rider, and therefore it doesn't affect the wizard. There you go, guys. I hope that was interesting and useful, like to say, to new players and veterans alike. This magic is different from what we've seen before. This is quite specific to Warhammer The Old World, so hopefully it was useful. Let me know your thoughts as well on the magic here, and if there's anything in particular you notice about the rules that we should all be aware of. If it was useful to you, give it a thumbs up. If it wasn't, though, give it a thumbs down. Let me know why in the comments down below. And as always, if you want to see more content, hit that subscribe button. It's totally free, and it's such a huge deal for me to allow me to keep doing this. So I really do appreciate it, and I really appreciate all those of you who have already supported either through a subscribe or just even watching the videos. So thank you for stopping by and checking my content out. You've been watching The Ghost Owl. I'll see you all very soon.